In the vast, unforgiving deserts of the Arizona Territory, where the line between survival and savagery is as thin as a razor's edge, history remembers the battles, the treaties, and the famous outlaws. But it forgets the whispers, the stories of lives irrevocably shattered and then remade in the crucible of conflict. This is one of those forgotten tales. It's the story of Miss Isabel Monroe, a Boston school teacher with dreams of a new life, and Kalen the Apache warrior, known only as the Ghost, who took her as a spoil of war. It's a story you won't find in the history books, a story of how a captive woman, stripped of everything she knew, faced the soul of a broken man and dared to tame the untamable. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory was a land of brutal contradictions. It was a canvas of breathtaking beauty, with mesas painted in strokes of ochre and crimson, and a sky so vast it could swallow a man's soul. But beneath that beauty lay a heart of stone, a place of thirst, dust, and sudden shocking violence. It was into this world that Isabel Monroe, aged 24, had journeyed, seeking not adventure but escape. Boston, with its stifling parlors and rigid expectations, had become a cage. Her future had been meticulously planned by her father, a stern shipping merchant, a sensible marriage to a man twice her age, Mr. Alistair Finch, whose touch was as cold and clammy as the coins he counted. Isabel, a woman with a mind full of literature and a heart full of quiet passions, felt herself suffocating. The advertisement for a governess position for the children of a wealthy rancher near Prescott seemed less like a job and more like a lifeline. Armed with 2 trunks of books and clothes, and a spirit far more resilient than her delicate features suggested she booked passage west. The final leg of her journey was with the Butterfield Overland Mail stagecoach, a bone-jarring, dust-choked affair, lumbering from Tucson to Prescott. The other passengers were a motley collection of the West's archetypes, a sweat-stained prospector named Silas, who mumbled about a silver strike in the Dragoon Mountains, a traveling preacher, Reverend Michael Davies, whose Bible was as worn as his face, and a young cavalry corporal, fresh-faced and nervous, returning to his post at Fort Lowell. "You're a brave woman, Miss Monroe," the Reverend had said, his voice raspy from the trail. "This is no country for the faint of heart. The Apache watch the roads, always." Isabel had offered a polite smile, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of saguaro cacti, standing like silent sentinels. God is as present here as he is in Boston, Reverend. The terror, when it came, was as sudden and absolute as a lightning strike from a clear blue sky. One moment the coach was rattling through a narrow canyon, the sandstone walls amplifying the creak of the leather and the plodding of the horses. The next, the world exploded. A high, ululating cry echoed from the ridges above a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. It wasn't human. It was the distilled essence of vengeance. The first shot took the driver. He simply slumped forward, a dark flower blooming on the back of his canvas shirt. The stagecoach lurched violently, a wheel splintering against a rock before the entire contraption crashed onto its side with a deafening shriek of tortured wood and metal. Isabel was thrown against the far wall, her head striking something hard. Dazed, she tasted blood and dust. The prospector Silas was trying to load a Colt revolver with trembling hands. The Reverend was praying, his eyes squeezed shut, a litany of psalms spilling from his lips. The young corporal, brave but outmatched, kicked open the jammed door and scrambled out rifle in hand. 2 shots rang out, followed by a choked cry that was abruptly silenced. The coach door was ripped from its hinges. The figures that filled the space were like spectres from a nightmare. They were lean, hard men, their skin the color of burnished copper, their bodies stripped for battle. They wore simple loincloths and high moccasins. Their black hair was held back by headbands, their faces grim and impassive. Apache. One warrior, his face streaked with black and white clay, grabbed Silas and dragged him out. A struggle, a glint of steel, and then silence. Another took the Reverend, who offered no resistance, his prayers never ceasing until a brutal blow silenced him forever. Isabel, huddled in the corner, her mind unable to process the sheer speed of the carnage. This wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. The air grew thick with the coppery smell of blood. Then he appeared. He didn't storm in like the others. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly terrifying. He was taller than the rest. His shoulders broad, his body a collection of taut, powerful muscles. A single eagle feather was tied in his long, unbound hair. But it was his eyes that held her. They were as black and depthless as a desert night, and in them burned a cold, ancient fire of pure, undiluted hatred. He carried a U.S. Army-issue Springfield rifle, as if it were an extension of his arm. This was their leader. His eyes swept the interior of the coach, dismissing the dead men as if they were discarded refuse. Then they fell upon her. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Isabel felt herself pinned by his gaze, every ounce of her Boston civility, her education, her faith stripped away, leaving only the raw, primal fear of a cornered animal. He said nothing. He simply reached in his hand, closing around her upper arm like a manacle of iron. His grip was not deliberately cruel, but it held the effortless strength of a man who could snap her arm without a thought. He pulled her from the wreckage, dragging her out into the blinding sunlight and the scene of utter devastation. The horses were gone. The supplies were being ransacked. The bodies of her fellow travelers lay twisted in the dust. She stumbled, her fashionable traveling dress, now torn and stained, catching on the broken coach. He didn't slow. He simply pulled harder, his silence, more terrifying than any shout. She was a bundle of rags to him, an object to be taken. A spoil. He half dragged, half carried her to a waiting pony, throwing her across its back like a sack of grain. As he swung up behind her, his hard-muscled body pressing against hers, she caught his scent, a mixture of horse sweat leather and something wild and elemental, like sun-baked earth and pine. As the war party melted back into the canyons from which they came, Isabel raised her head for one last look at the smoking ruin of her new life. In the distance, she saw a rider, a lone figure on the horizon, watching them. A rancher. A patrol. A flicker of hope ignited within her, only to be instantly extinguished. The rider did not give chase. He simply watched them disappear. Her captor spurred his horse, and the world dissolved into a blur of rock sky and galloping hooves. Isabel Monroe, the Boston schoolteacher, was gone. In her place was only a possession, a spoil of war carried into the heart of the Apache wilderness by a warrior whose eyes held the chilling emptiness of a soul long dead. His name, she would learn, was Kalen, and his hatred for her world was the only thing that kept him alive. The journey was a descent into a living hell. The sun was a relentless hammer, the landscape a monotonous blur of scorched rock and thorny scrub. Isabel had read novels of the West of brave pioneers and noble savages, but the reality was a grit-caked, sweat-soaked agony that defied all romanticism. Kalen rode with an unnerving stillness, a man perfectly fused with his horse. He never spoke a word to her or to any of his warriors. His communication was a language of subtle gestures, a flick of the wrist, a slight turn of the head that his men understood instantly. He was their leader not through noise, but through an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority. Isabel was his prisoner, but he treated her with a profound and chilling indifference. He seemed to barely acknowledge her existence beyond the physical fact of her presence. When she sagged from exhaustion, his iron grip on her waist would tighten, holding her in place. When thirst became an unbearable torment, making her tongue swell in her dry mouth, he would eventually stop dismount and press a water skin to her lips, but his eyes would be scanning the horizon, ever watchful, never looking at her. The water was not an act of mercy. It was maintenance of a captured asset. They traveled for 2 days, moving with a speed and stealth that seemed supernatural. They left no trail a layman could follow, weaving through arroyos and canyons, their ponies stepping with uncanny silence on the rocky ground. The nights were a different kind of trial. The temperature plummeted, and the desert's cold seeped into Isabel's bones. She was given a piece of dried meat so tough it made her jaw ache, and allowed to sleep near the low-burning fire, but not too near. She was separate other, an outcast. The other warriors occasionally glanced at her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and contempt. She was a symbol of the White Eyes, the Pindalicoyer who had stolen their land, slaughtered the buffalo, and murdered their families. One warrior in particular, a man with a jagged scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer, watched her with open hostility. His name was Nokona, and his gaze made Isabel's skin crawl. He would mutter things to the others in their own tongue, the harsh syllables always ending with a dark look in her direction. On the 3rd day they arrived at the stronghold. It was not a village of teepees as Isabel had imagined. It was a rancheria, a hidden settlement nestled in a high mountain valley, a natural fortress of stone and pine. It was a place of frantic, desperate life. Women worked hides, children played in the dust with startling silence, and old men sat mending weapons, their faces like maps of hardship. The arrival of the war party caused a stir. Kaelan dismounted, pulling Isabel from the pony and shoving her forward. The entire community fell silent, their eyes fixing on her. It was a heavy, suffocating gaze, devoid of pity. She saw the same burning hatred from Kaelan's eyes, reflected in 100 others. These were a people pushed to the edge, a nation fighting a losing war for their very existence, and she was a trophy from that war. An old woman with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple approached. She spat on the ground at Isabel's feet and began to speak in a torrent of angry Apache, her words directed at Kaelan. He listened impassively, his face a mask of stone. When she finished, he replied with a single, guttural word. The woman fell silent, but her glare remained. Isabel was thrust into the care of a woman named Taza. She was younger than the old crone, perhaps in her late 30s, but her face was already etched with grief. Taza led Isabel to a small dome-shaped wickiup made of brush and hide. Inside, it was dark and smelled of smoke and earth. Taza tossed a worn blanket at her and pointed to a stack of hides that needed scraping. The message was clear: she was not a guest. She was a slave. Her life became a routine of grueling labor and quiet terror. She scraped hides until her hands were raw and blistered. She hauled water from a distant spring, the heavy clay pots digging into her shoulders. She ground corn on a stone metate until her back screamed in protest. Her fine dress was soon a tattered rag, and Taza gave her a simple deerskin tunic, a garment of pure function that erased the last vestiges of the woman she had been. The silence was the worst part. No one spoke to her, except to issue a sharp command. She was a ghost in their midst, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the world that was destroying them. The children, who in any other circumstance would have been a source of comfort to the former governess, shied away from her as if she carried a disease. Kaelin remained a distant, formidable presence. He was the war chief, the strategic heart of his band of Chiricahua. He would spend hours staring at crude maps drawn in the dirt, planning their next raid, their next desperate act of survival. Isabel would sometimes see him watching her from across the camp, his expression unreadable. It wasn't a look of lust or even of possession. It was something colder, more analytical. He was studying her like a strange creature he had captured, trying to understand its nature. One evening, exhausted and heartsick, Isabel found a quiet spot behind a cluster of boulders away from the prying eyes of the camp. The loneliness, the sheer hopelessness of her situation finally broke through her carefully constructed composure. She drew her knees to her chest and wept not loudly, but with the silent, body-racking sobs of someone who has lost everything. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled, her breath catching in her throat. It was Kaelin. He stood over her, the dying light of the sunset, catching the sharp planes of his face. He held a small, crudely carved wooden bird in his hand. He did not speak. He simply watched her cry, his head tilted slightly. There was no pity in his eyes, but for the first time, the inferno of hatred seemed to have banked, replaced by a flicker of something she could not name. It might have been curiosity. It might have been a long-forgotten memory. After a long moment, he crouched down, his movements fluid and silent. He extended his hand, the one holding the wooden bird. His fingers were long and calloused, a warrior's hands, yet the carving was delicate, detailed. Isabel flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, he simply opened his hand, letting the small bird drop into her lap. He then rose and walked away without a word, melting back into the shadows of the camp. Isabel stared at the wooden bird resting on her deerskin tunic. It was a simple, almost childish object, yet it was the first human gesture she had received since her capture. It was not kindness, not yet. But it was a crack in the wall of silence, a single inexplicable act that suggested the man who was her captor, the ghost of the mountains, was more than just the monster she believed him to be. It was a question posed in a language of wood and silence, and she had no idea how to answer it. The wooden bird became Isabel's secret talisman. She kept it hidden in a fold of her tunic, a small, tangible mystery in a world defined by harsh certainties. Kaelin's act had unsettled her more than his violence. Violence she could understand as a part of this savage land. A silent, inexplicable gesture was a puzzle that her mind worried at constantly. Her life of drudgery continued, but a subtle shift had occurred. She began to observe, not just endure. She saw the tenderness with which a mother treated her child. She saw the deep respect given to the elders. She saw the grief in Taza's eyes, and learned from a rare, whispered comment from another captive, a Mexican woman taken years ago, that Taza's husband and 2 sons had been killed at a place called Camp Grant, not in battle but massacred while they slept. These people were not monsters. They were a nation in mourning, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Her captor remained an enigma. Kaelin rarely stayed in the rancheria for long. He led raids, scouted and hunted, always moving, always vigilant. But when he was there, a strange, unspoken awareness grew between them. He would watch her as she worked, his gaze intense. He still did not speak to her, but his indifference had been replaced by a watchful gravity. The change was not lost on Nokona, the warrior with the scarred face. His hostility towards Isabel grew more overt. He saw her as a corrupting influence, a white disease in their midst. One afternoon, as Isabel was carrying water from the spring, Nokona blocked her path. He sneered, speaking in broken guttural English he must have learned from raids or reservations. "White woman, you are bad luck. You make our chief weak." Isabel stood her ground, her heart hammering. "I have done nothing." "You do nothing?" He mimicked his hand darting out to grab the clay pot from her shoulder. He raised it high. "This is what you are. Easy to break." He was about to smash it on the ground when a voice, low and dangerous, cut through the air. "Nokona." Kaelin stood not 10 feet away, appearing as if from the very earth. He had been cleaning his rifle, and he held it loosely in one hand, but his entire posture was coiled with lethal intent. His eyes were not on Isabel, but locked on his warrior. Nokona hesitated, his face a mask of defiant anger. "She is a witch. She softens your spirit." Kaelin took a slow step forward. He spoke in Apache, his voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. The words were a cascade of harsh, powerful sounds. Though Isabel could not understand them, the meaning was clear. "She is mine. You will not touch her." Nokona held Kaelin's gaze for a tense moment, a battle of wills playing out in the silent canyon. Finally, with a grunt of disgust, Nokona lowered the pot, shoving it roughly back at Isabel, spilling water down her tunic. He stalked away, casting one last look of pure venom over his shoulder. Kaelin watched him go before his eyes turned to Isabel. She was trembling, not from fear of Nokona, but from the raw protective power she had just witnessed. He had defended her. He walked over to her, his gaze dropping to the dark, wet patch on her tunic. For the first time he spoke to her directly, his English as rough and spare as Nokona's, but with a different cadence. "You are not hurt." It was a statement, not a question. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. "No." He looked at her hands, which were blistered and raw from her work. He reached out not to grab, but with an open palm. Hesitantly, she let him take her hand. He turned it over his thumb, gently tracing the broken skin. His touch was surprisingly gentle, the calloused pads of his fingers a strange contrast to the soft skin of her palm. "These are not the hands of your people," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was a teacher," she whispered. He looked up, his black eyes meeting hers. "Words. Your people use many words. They lie." He released her hand and gestured to the mountains around them. "The land does not lie. The sun does not lie." That evening, Taza approached Isabel, and without a word, handed her a small pot of a greasy, pungent salve made from yucca root and herbs. Isabel applied it to her hands, and the relief was immediate. It was an act of kindness, an echo of Kaelin's own gesture. Something was changing. A few nights later, a sickness swept through the camp, a fever that burned hot and fast, particularly affecting the children. Isabel, having nursed her own younger brother through scarlet fever years ago, recognized the signs of dehydration and the need for constant cooling cloths. While the medicine man chanted and shook his rattles, Isabel went to work. She found Taza's young daughter, a girl of 5, named Letta, shivering and listless. Taza sat beside her, her face a mask of stoic despair. Isabel, ignoring the woman's initial suspicious glare, dipped a cloth in cool water and began to gently bathe the child's forehead. She coaxed sips of water between the girl's cracked lips. She did this for hours long after the moon had risen high in the sky. At some point in the deep of the night, Kaelin entered the wickiup. He stood in the shadows watching her. Isabel, too, focused on the sick child to be afraid, simply continued her work. He finally came forward and crouched beside her. He looked at Letta, then at Isabel. "You have this sickness?" he asked. No, I had something like it as a child. The fever must be cooled. She needs water." He watched her for a long time, his gaze tracing the lines of her face in the flickering firelight. He saw not a frightened captive, but a woman of quiet, determined strength. He then shifted, turning his back slightly toward the fire. He pulled aside the buckskin shirt he wore, revealing a canvas of scarred tissue on his back and side. The scars were old, silvery white against his dark skin, a chaotic web of lines from whips, knives, and one large, puckered circle that could only have been a bullet wound. "My father," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "was killed at Apache Pass by soldiers under a flag of truce. My mother and sister, taken to a reservation in Florida to die of coughing sickness. I was a boy. I was taken to a mine near Silver City. These," he touched his back, "are from the white man's words." Isabel stared at the horrific tapestry of his past, and a profound, aching understanding dawned in her heart. His hatred was not a random force of nature. It was a shield. It was the scarred shell over a soul that had been brutalized beyond comprehension. He was not just a warrior. He was a survivor, the last remnant of a shattered family. She slowly lifted her hand, the one he had examined days before, and hesitantly, gently laid her palm against the unscarred skin of his shoulder. It was a simple, profound touch, an acknowledgement of his pain. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, a flicker of something ancient and sorrowful passing across his face. In the dim light of the wickiup, with a sick child breathing softly beside them, the warrior and his captive shared a moment of silent communion, a language not of words, but of scars. The fragile truce born in the fire-lit wickiup slowly blossomed into something more complex. Kaelin began to speak to Isabel, not often, but with purpose. He taught her the names of the plants, which ones could heal, which could feed, and which could kill. He showed her how to read the subtle signs of the desert, a bent twig, a displaced stone, the flight of a hawk. It was a practical education, a primer in survival, but for Isabel, it felt like he was sharing the pages of his soul. In turn, she told him of Boston, of the sea of buildings so tall they scraped the clouds. She read to him from the one book she had managed to salvage from her trunk, a small volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. He would listen, his face impassive, as she read of love and loss and beauty concepts, so alien to his world, yet universally human. He called the book her Talking Leaves. This change was met with deep suspicion by Nokona and his followers, but Kaelin's authority was absolute. He was not just their chief, he was their visionary. He was the ghost who could raid a U.S. Army supply wagon and vanish into thin air, the man who kept them fed and armed when all other bands had been forced onto the reservations. And now his vision seemed to include the white woman. The world outside their mountain sanctuary, however, was not idle. The raid on the Butterfield stagecoach had not gone unnoticed. In the dusty, burgeoning town of Tombstone, a new authority had arrived, Captain Robert Sterling of the 5th Cavalry. Sterling was a man carved from the same hard rock as the territory he sought to tame. He was ambitious, ruthless, and carried a deep personal animosity towards the Apache. Years earlier, his younger brother, a fresh-faced lieutenant, had been killed in an ambush, led by a then unknown warrior. That warrior, Sterling had learned, was Kaelin. For Sterling, this was not a military campaign. It was a vendetta. He was not there to pacify. He was there to exterminate. He was a man of cold, methodical cruelty. His scouts were Tonkawa traditional enemies of the Apache, who were paid handsomely for every Apache scalp they brought in. His methods were brutal and effective. He didn't chase war parties. He tracked them back to their families. He destroyed their food caches, poisoned their water sources, and waged a war of attrition. He was hunting the ghost, and he was patient. One day, Kalen's scouts returned with grim news. A small band of Mescalero Apache, who had been given sanctuary in their valley, had been found, slaughtered. Not just the warriors, but the women, the children, the old. All of them. The bodies were mutilated, a clear message from the Tonkawa scouts, from Captain Sterling. A pall of rage and fear fell over the rancheria. The drums beat through the night, a somber, angry rhythm. The men painted their faces for war, their voices rising in songs of mourning and vengeance. Isabel watched, her heart cold with dread. She saw the old, hard mask of hatred slip back over Kalen's face, erasing the man who listened to sonnets and carved birds. He gathered his warriors. His words were sharp, guttural, and filled with a pain so raw it was terrifying. Nokona stood beside him, his scarred face alight with a grim satisfaction. This was the chief. He knew. The chief he followed. Before he left, Kalen came to Isabel. His eyes were once again the obsidian chips she remembered from the day of her capture. "Stay here," he commanded. "Taza will watch you." "Where are you going?" she asked, though she already knew. "To teach the soldier chief a lesson, to show him what a ghost can do." He turned to leave, but Isabel grabbed his arm. "Vengeance will not bring them back, Kalen. It will only create more graves." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. His expression was bleak. "It is all we have left." He was gone for 3 days. They were the longest days of Isabel's life. The camp was tense, the women and children hiding in the caves that riddled the mountainside. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a bird sent a fresh wave of fear through the community. On the 4th day, the war party returned. They were not triumphant. They carried their wounded on makeshift litters. 3 warriors were dead. Kalen had a bloody bandage wrapped around his left forearm, and his face was grim. He had found Sterling's supply train, but it had been a trap. The wagons were filled not with ammunition and food, but with heavily armed soldiers. Sterling had anticipated his move. It had been a fierce, desperate fight, and while Kalen's band had managed to escape, they had paid a heavy price. Sterling was a different kind of enemy. He was smart, he was relentless, and he was getting closer. That night, Kalen sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his silence a heavy weight. The defeat had shaken him. Isabel approached cautiously and sat near him. She had cleaned and redressed his wound, her touch gentle and practiced. "He knew you were coming," she said softly. Kalen nodded, not looking at her. "He thinks like me. He uses my own paths against me." "Then you must find a new path," she urged. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes full of a weariness that seemed a centuries old. "There are no new paths. There is only this mountain, and the graves of my people." A new sound suddenly cut through the night, a high, lonely whistle followed by another from a different direction. It was a signal. Scouts. But it wasn't an Apache signal. Instantly, Kalen was on his feet, grabbing his rifle. "Soldiers," he hissed. "They found us." Panic erupted in the camp. Warriors scrambled for weapons, mothers grabbed their children and fled for the caves. Sterling had not been content with his victory. He had followed the retreating war party. He had found their sanctuary. Kalen grabbed Isabel's arm. "To the high caves. Now." As they ran through the chaos, Nokona appeared, his face a mask of fury. He pointed an accusing finger at Isabel. "This is her fault. She is their eyes. She led them here." "Silence, Nokona," Kalen roared. "She is with us." But the seed of doubt was planted. Other warriors looked from Isabel to Kalen, their expressions wavering. Before the argument could escalate, the first volley of shots echoed through the valley. The soldiers were coming up the main trail, their rifles spitting fire into the darkness. The hunt was over. The siege had begun. The valley became a death trap. Captain Sterling was a master of siege warfare. He didn't order a full frontal assault, which would have been costly against the dug-in Apache. Instead, he occupied the high ground, controlling the main entrance and the only reliable spring. He was content to wait to let thirst and starvation do his work for him. His snipers were positioned with deadly accuracy, making any movement in the open a suicidal act. The Apache, now trapped, retreated to the network of caves that honeycombed the canyon walls. The mood was grim. The initial shock had given way to a quiet, simmering despair. Their fortress had become their prison. Isabel stayed with Taza and the other women and children in the largest of the caves. The air was thick with the smell of fear and wood smoke. The cries of hungry children were a constant heartbreaking refrain. Isabel did what she could, rationing the dwindling water supply, comforting the terrified, and tending to the wounded from the initial skirmish. She was no longer the outsider. She was one of them, sharing their fate. Kalen was a whirlwind of desperate energy. He organized the defenses, planned rationing, and tried to maintain the morale of his warriors. But Isabel could see the strain on his face. He felt the weight of every hungry child, every frightened woman. This was his band, his family, and he had led them into a trap. The accusation from Nokona had poisoned the air. Though Kalen had defended her many warriors, now looked at Isabel with suspicion. Was it possible, had she somehow signaled the soldiers? The idea was absurd, but in their fear and desperation, they needed someone to blame. Nokona stoked these fears, his whispers, more damaging than any open confrontation. On the third day of the siege, the water ran out. The children's cries became weak, raspy moans. Taza's daughter later, the child Isabel had nursed through fever, was fading fast. That night, a council of warriors was held. Isabel watched from the shadows as they argued. Nokona's voice was the loudest. "We must break out," he argued. "We attack tonight. A glorious death is better than dying of thirst like caged rats." Kalen stood against him. "A breakout is what Sterling wants. He has a dozen Sharps rifles on the ridge. He would mow us down before we crossed the valley floor. It would be a slaughter, not a battle." "Then what, Chief?" Nokona challenged, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do we wait for your white woman to save us? Perhaps she can use her talking leaves to bargain for our lives." The other warriors murmured in agreement. Kalen's leadership was being openly questioned for the first time. He silenced them with a look. "There is another way, a path he does not know. The Needle's Eye. It is a narrow passage high on the west ridge. It is dangerous, barely wide enough for one man, but it leads out of the valley." "It is a goat path," another warrior scoffed. "We cannot take the women and children that way." "We will," Kalen stated, his voice ringing with authority. "We will move at night. I will lead the way. We will leave everything behind. We become ghosts again." It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only hope. The plan was set. They would leave the following night. Later, Kalen found Isabel sitting alone at the mouth of the cave, staring out at the cruel stars. The soldiers' campfires twinkled in the distance like a malevolent constellation. "You heard?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded. "It is a dangerous plan." "It is the only plan." He sat beside her, the stone still warm from the departed sun. "Nokona is right about one thing. I have grown distracted." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. "Before you came, there was only hate. It made me sharp. It kept me alive. Now," he trailed off. Now there is something else, she finished for him, her voice barely a whisper. Is that so terrible? For me it is a weakness, he said grimly. For my people, it could be death. He stood abruptly, as if he couldn't bear the intimacy of the moment. Tomorrow night you will go with Taza and the children. Do exactly as I say. Do not make a sound. As he turned to leave, Isabel made a decision. It was a choice born of everything she had seen, everything she had endured, a choice between the world she had been born into and the world that had claimed her. There is another way, she said, her voice clear and strong. He stopped, turning back to her. A better way. Captain Sterling wants you. He wants the ghost. He doesn't care about the women and children. Kalen stared at her, a dawning horror in his eyes, as he understood what she was proposing. No. Listen to me, she insisted, standing to face him. Let me go to him. I am a white woman, a captive. He will see me as a victim needing rescue. I will tell him you are dead, that you were killed in the first assault. I will tell him the rest of the warriors are scattered and fleeing south. He will believe me. He will claim his victory, take his rescued captive, and leave. He will hurt you, Kalen said, his voice a raw, guttural sound. Men like him, they will not see you as a lady from Boston. They will see you as something spoiled by us. It's a risk I am willing to take, she said, her gaze unwavering. To save later. To save Taza. To save your people. To save you. He took a step towards her, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The conflict in his eyes was a terrible thing to witness. The warrior, the chief, screamed at him to refuse to fight to the last man. But the man who had listened to sonnets, the man who had been touched by a kindness he had long forgotten, saw the terrifying logic in her plan. Why? He whispered the question, torn from the depths of his soul. Why would you do this for us? Isabel reached up and gently touched the side of his face. Her fingers traced the hard line of his jaw. Because my own people showed me cruelty long before I ever met you. I was a different kind of captive in Boston, Kalen, caged by rules and expectations. You took me as a spoil of war, but you are the first man who has ever truly seen me. Your people have shown me what it means to fight for a family, to endure the impossible. I am no longer just Isabel Monroe of Boston. She took a deep breath. My place is here. In that moment, under the cold, distant stars, with the enemy campfires burning below the last wall between them, crumbled. Kalen reached out his hand, tangling in her hair, and pulled her to him. He kissed her, not with the gentle tenderness of a drawing-room romance, but with a desperate, raw passion, born of fear and loss, and a profound, aching love. It was a kiss of farewell, a kiss that acknowledged a sacrifice that would tear them apart. When he broke away, his breath was ragged. He pressed his forehead against hers. If he harms you, Kalen vowed, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before, I will follow him to the end of the earth. I will burn his world to ash. This I swear. He then stepped back, the chief once more. The decision was made. Isabel Monroe, his spoil, his captive, was about to become the savior of his people by walking back into the very world that had cast her out. The plan was forged in desperation, a final, terrible gamble whispered in the pre-dawn chill. Kalen's warriors would prepare for the perilous escape through the Needle's Eye, while Isabel prepared for a different kind of journey, a walk back into the jaws of the world she had fled. Her appearance was meticulously crafted. They tore her deerskin tunic, smeared her face with dust, and used a drop of blood from Kalen's arm to create the convincing illusion of a head wound. She was no longer Isabel Monroe, but a role she had to play the broken victim. Their farewell was a moment of profound, silent agony. Taza, the woman who had once despised her, embraced her as a sister. Even Nokona, his face a mask of grudging respect, gave a solemn nod. He finally understood that her loyalty wasn't to her people, but to his. Alone with Kaelin at the edge of the shadows, words failed them. He pressed a small, sharp shard of obsidian into her palm. "If he—" Kaelin started his voice, a raw whisper, unable to finish the thought. She closed her hand around the stone, the message understood. "I will watch from the highest peak until you are gone," he vowed. "Live, Kaelin," she pleaded, her eyes locking with his. "Live for your people." He pulled her to him, then a desperate, final kiss that was not of love, but of farewell, a searing acknowledgement of a sacrifice that would tear their worlds apart. With one last look, Isabel turned and began her descent into the lion's den. She stumbled through the dry creek bed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. As she neared the army camp, she let herself fall, crying out into the stillness. "Hold there! Who goes?" a voice barked. Within moments, 2 soldiers were upon her, their rifles lowering in shock at the sight of a battered white woman. She was rushed into the camp, a prize, a spectacle. And then she was brought before him. Captain Robert Sterling emerged from his tent, his uniform immaculate, his cold blue eyes dissecting her with chilling precision. "I am Captain Sterling," he announced. "You are safe now, Miss Monroe. Isabel Monroe." She choked out, playing her part to perfection. "I was his captive. And the ghost." Sterling asked, his voice sharp with anticipation. With tears she did not have to feign, Isabel told the lie they had created. Kaelin was dead shot by a sniper from the ridge during the initial assault. The Apache, leaderless and broken, had scattered, fleeing south to Mexico. She had escaped in the chaos. Sterling's face broke into a triumphant smile. He had won. He had avenged his brother and cemented his legend. "You saw him fall. You are certain?" "I saw it." She whispered the lie, a bitter stone in her throat. They carried his body away. "Excellent," Sterling declared. He turned to his sergeant. "Break camp. The campaign is over. We're returning to Tombstone." His gaze returned to Isabel, a veneer of chivalry masking a predatory gleam. "You have been through a terrible ordeal, Miss Monroe. Do not worry. Civilization will wash the stain away." The journey to Tombstone was a surreal nightmare. Sterling paraded her like a trophy of war, his constant presence a suffocating reminder of her bargain. He saw her not as a rescued woman, but as an object he now owned, tainted and made more interesting by her time with the savages. She was housed in the finest room at the Cosmopolitan Hotel, but it was another cage, guarded and isolated. The truth of his nature was fully revealed 2 nights later. He entered her room, the smell of whiskey on his breath, his cold eyes burning with a possessive fire. "You are a remarkable woman, Isabel," he slurred, advancing on her. "We are bound by this, you and I. I am your savior." "I am grateful, Captain," she said, backing away her hand, closing around the obsidian hidden in her pocket. "Gratitude is not enough," he snarled, his gentlemanly facade vanishing. He lunged, grabbing her arm. "That savage filth turned you, but I will burn it out of you." Isabel reacted on pure instinct. She brought her hand up, slashing the sharp obsidian across his face. Sterling roared in pain and fury, stumbling back with blood pouring from a deep gash on his cheek. His eyes were filled with murderous rage. "You savage whore!" He bellowed, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. Before he could draw the weapon, the hotel room door slammed open. Sheriff John Bayon stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 deputies, his expression grim. "That's enough, Sterling." Behind the sheriff stood another man, dressed in a fine suit that was out of place in Tombstone. "Captain Sterling," the man said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm Philip Crane, Department of the Interior. You are relieved of command." He held up a telegram. "An investigation has been opened into your methods. It seems scalping women and children is frowned upon in Washington. You've become a liability." Sterling stared, dumbfounded, as the deputies moved in to restrain him. His brutal tactics, his secret atrocities, had finally come to light. As he was dragged away, sputtering threats, Isabel sagged against the wall, the bloody obsidian falling from her numb fingers. Philip Crane turned to her, his expression softening with pity. "Miss Monroe, you are truly safe now." She was safe. She was free. But as she looked out the window toward the dark, silent mountains, a profound emptiness consumed her. She had won her freedom, but had lost everything else. Kaelin, believing she was secure in a world she no longer belonged to, was gone, a ghost, once more, vanished into the wilderness, and out of her life forever. The weeks following Captain Sterling's arrest were a disorienting haze. Isabel's testimony, delivered in private to a military tribunal, was the final nail in the captain's coffin. Stripped of his command and publicly disgraced his reign of terror, was over. Isabel was lauded as a frontier heroine, her story sensationalized in newspapers across the country. To the world, she was the brave captive who had escaped savagery and returned to the righteous fold of civilization. But Isabel felt like a fraud. Philip Crane, the official from the Department of the Interior, treated her with paternal kindness, arranging for her safe passage back to Boston. Her father's telegram was a cold, clear command. "Return at once. End this shameful spectacle." The thought of returning to that gilded cage was impossible. The woman who had survived the Arizona wilderness could no longer breathe in the stifling air of Boston society. She politely refused Crane's offer. Tombstone, with its dusty streets and boisterous saloons, was hardly a home, but the mountains that loomed on the horizon were a constant, silent reminder of where her heart truly lay. She was a woman caught between 2 worlds, belonging to neither. To anchor herself, she found a purpose. The town needed a schoolteacher, and Isabel, armed with her education and a newfound resilience, took the position. A year passed. Miss Monroe became a respected, if enigmatic, figure in the community. She was the Apache teacher, a woman who carried a quiet sorrow that no one dared to question. She taught the children of miners and merchants how to read and write, but she also tried to teach them empathy, telling stories of the land and the people who were there first. She lived a life of quiet dignity, but every sunset that painted the Chiricahua Mountains in strokes of fire was a fresh torment. Every night she dreamt of a man with eyes like a desert night. Her lonely peace was shattered on a cool autumn evening. One of her students, a young boy named Jacob, ran to her as she was leaving the schoolhouse, his face alight with excitement. "Miss Monroe, I saw it, up by the old mission ruins." "Saw what, Jacob?" she asked, her heart giving a strange flutter. "A wooden bird," he exclaimed, "just like in your story, the one about the silent man in the mountains." The breath caught in Isabel's throat. She had used the story of Kaelin's carving as an allegory in her lessons, a private tribute no one could understand. "Show me," she whispered. He led her up the trail toward the crumbling adobe walls of the mission. There, hanging from a mesquite branch, was a small, newly carved wooden bird. It was his work, unmistakably. The delicate lines, the patient craftsmanship. It was a message sent across an impassable divide. He was close. He was alive. She sent the boy home and stood there as dusk bled across the sky, her gaze fixed on the darkening peaks. Was he watching her? A rustle in the brush nearby caused her to spin around her hand, flying to her throat. A figure emerged from the twilight shadows. It was not Kaelin, but a woman she thought she would never see again. It was Taza. The Apache woman's face was more deeply lined with hardship, but her eyes held the same unbreakable strength. She raised a hand in peace. "Isabel." She said the name, a bridge across their separate worlds. "Taza, you're safe," Isabel cried, relief washing over her. "And the others, we are safe," Taza confirmed. "We found a new home, a hidden valley. We live, but he—" She paused, her gaze heavy with sorrow. "He does not live. He only waits." "What do you mean?" "His spirit is not with us. It is here, tethered to this town to you," Taza said, her voice low and urgent. "He saw the soldier chief taken away. He knows you are safe. But he is a ghost now, a chief, with no war to fight, a hunter, with no family to feed. His soul is untethered." Taza reached into a pouch and handed Isabel a deerskin bundle. Inside was a simple, beautifully made Apache dress, adorned with fine quill work. "He will not come to your world of cages, Isabel. But you are no longer of that world. A choice must be made. Tonight." Taza's eyes lifted to the highest mountain peak, now a black silhouette against the star-dusted sky. "He waits there. He will wait until the morning star rises. If you do not come, he will leave this land and be gone forever." She placed a hand on Isabel's arm, a final sisterly gesture. "You taught us that one heart can be stronger than many rifles. Now you must listen to your own." With that, Taza turned and vanished back into the shadows as silently as she had appeared. Isabel stood alone, the deerskin dress clutched in her hands, the wooden bird heralding a choice that would define the rest of her life. Before her lay the flickering lights of Tombstone, a life of safety, respect, and quiet emptiness. Behind her lay the immense, dark wilderness, a life of hardship, uncertainty, and a love that had remade her very soul. It was not a choice between civilization and savagery. It was a choice between two kinds of freedom, two halves of herself. The woman who had taught school in a dusty town, and the woman who had nursed a sick child in a hidden rancheria were one and the same. She looked from the town to the mountain, and for the first time in a year, her path was illuminated with absolute clarity. Turning her back on the lights, Isabel Munro began the long walk toward the mountains, toward the waiting ghost, and toward the only home her heart would ever know. Isabel Munro's story isn't one you'll find etched on a monument or recorded in the official archives of the West. It exists in the realm of possibility, a testament to the untold stories of those caught between worlds. It's a powerful reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and battles, but a tapestry woven from individual lives of love loss and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Her journey from captive to savior, from a woman of society to a queen of the wilderness, challenges our understanding of strength and belonging. It asks us if a soul can be tamed or if it simply finds its match in another. If this story of the untamed West and the unexpected love that blossomed within it resonated with you, please take a moment to hit the like button. Share it with others who appreciate tales of history drama and the enduring power of the human heart. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the forgotten stories that shaped our world. Thank you for listening.